Okay, so we got through the technical part of shutter speed. Let's now move on to the creative options that shutter speed gives us. When you are dealing with shutter speed, you need to ask yourself two questions when you're shooting your images. The first is there any motion in my image? And if there is, do I want to blur or freeze that motion? So here's a couple of examples of the exact same shot of frozen motion. You can see that the water is frozen, and then blurred motion. And this is a very common technique used by photographers when they are shooting water. You've also seen light trails before in lots of photographs. You can see here, this is a great example of a really fast shutter speed in order to freeze the motion. And here's some light trails like we were talking about earlier that all the photographer needed to do for this was to set a slow shutter speed in their camera. Now there are two very important shutter speeds that we need to know. The first is 1/500th of a second, and for us this means frozen motion. It's actually going to be more of our starting point for freezing motion. Sometimes you can freeze motion at like 200th of a second, but we're always going to set our camera at the starting point for 1/500th of a second if our intention is to freeze motion. Sports photos would be a great example. Okay, you want to freeze the motion there. The other one is 1/60th of a second. This is where we are starting point for blurring motion, and it is also the slowest that you can handhold a camera. You cannot physically handhold a camera with any shutter speed slower than that, otherwise you are going to get a little bit of camera shake in your images. And the reason for this is you need to understand that there's a lot going on in your body. Okay, your heart is pumping, your lungs are inflating and deflating, and that movement is being transferred into the camera. Now when you're using really fast shutter speeds, it's able to freeze motion no problem and to have really sharp images because it's doing it so quickly that it's kind of negating the things that are going on externally. Both of the above, as I mentioned, are starting points for the creative effect. Okay, you might put 1/60th of a second into your camera and attempt to blur, say, a car, and you'll find that there's not enough blur on the car. Okay, again, it's only our starting point. So to really get additional blur, you would go slower. Okay, so 1/500th of a second, that's where we're going to start for frozen motion. As a starting point, you can go up or down to get the exact effect that you're looking for, and then 1/60th of a second for blurring motion. Now, what happens if you're taking an image that doesn't have any motion? So here's a great example of this girl. Okay, we know that there's no motion going on, it's just a simple portrait shot. So for us, shutter speed isn't really all that important. In fact, we're not really going to be too concerned with it, except we always have to make sure that our shutter speed is faster than 1/60th of a second. Otherwise, we can't handhold this shot. So every single time we're going to take a shot, you should be taking note of the shutter speed to ensure that it is fast enough for handheld shooting. Okay, one thing I forgot to put in the the shutter speed technical was talking about TV mode, which is the shutter priority mode. In this mode on our camera, under the creative modes, it lets the user choose the shutter speed, and then the camera will automatically choose the appropriate aperture to give you a good exposure. Now, the easiest thing that for you guys at this point in your photography careers to understand about shutter speed is that if our intention is to blur or freeze motion, set your camera to shutter priority, start putting in the default starting point value. So let's say you want to freeze motion 1/500th of a second, and then let the camera do the rest of the work for you. Okay, ISO is a whole nother beast that we'll talk about in a later video, but let the camera choose the appropriate aperture to give you a proper exposure. If shutter speed is not a priority for you, then don't even use shutter priority mode at all. Okay, so again, I can't say it enough. Just use TV mode when you want to blur or freeze motion in your image. If you don't care or there is no motion, then shutter priority is of no consideration to you. So a quick recap. Fast shutter speeds will freeze motion and slow ones will blur motion. TV mode or shutter priority mode allows us to choose the shutter speed, and the camera chooses an appropriate aperture for a correct exposure. It's the exact opposite as aperture priority mode that we learned about earlier, where you put in the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed for you. If motion isn't a concern or a goal, shutter speed is only important in respect to ensuring it's fast enough to handhold. And finally, there are two shutter speeds we absolutely have to know. The first is 1/60th of a second. That is the starting point for blur, and it is the slowest that we can handhold a camera. And then finally, to freeze motion, 1/500th of a second is going to be our starting point. Okay, so that's it for shutter speed. We're going to talk about ISO and then jump into the relationship between aperture and shutter speed. Have a good one.